I had just checked in at the desk with the Synod's Vocation and Examining Committee, a committee that over the course of the next couple of days would decide whether or not I got to go to seminary, whether or not they would give me their endorsement. To say that I was a little nervous would have been a pretty big understatement. I was making my way down the rather long, dark, dingy hallway to where the group was about to gather for worship, when all of a sudden an arm thrust through the crook of my arm and pulled me tight. I spun, expecting to see a classmate or a pastor that I'd met at some point within the life of the Synod, but instead there was this rather little elfish character. His bald head was ringed with white hair. He had a matching white beard, neatly trimmed, and eyes that danced with delight and perhaps just a little mischief. "You're Jake." "Yes, I am." "I hear you sing." "Some would say that." "Good, because you're sitting next to me at worship, because I don't." And so I was introduced to the Reverend Dr. Paul Gerhard, who over the course of the next 20 years became my dear, dear friend. He was a colleague, a mentor, a teacher. We spent many hours with he and his wife, Helen, before her untimely death. He took my kids to the zoo, to the art museum, to the pirate games. He was a little kid at heart, and such a gifted pastor, gifted preacher, gifted teacher. He loved music, even though he couldn't sing. He was an artist, a poet. So many gifts, and yet the gift that I remember most from him was his gift of humility. If ever there was someone that could have been puffed up, it was PG, but he wasn't. And it wasn't that false humility that turns humility upside down and makes it some kind of a merit. "Oh, look how wonderfully humble I am. Aren't I great?" But rather a deep and abiding humility. Jesus in Luke's Gospel talks about this kind of humility. He tells a story about two men who go up to the temple to pray, a Pharisee and a sinner. The Pharisee prays, lifting his eyes to heaven, "Oh God, how wonderful I am. I am so glad I'm not like all the rest of that riffraff. I have done all the right things. I have lived a holy life. I am good." On the other hand, the other man comes before God on bended knee, beating his breast. "Oh Lord, I am a sinner. Forgive me. I have nothing to offer." Jesus says it will be the latter who will go forth from there justified, because he gets it. You see, humility is not about what we do or what we say, but rather about how we see. It's a matter of perspective. The man in the story, PG, understood perfectly well that before God they had nothing to offer, no leg to stand on. As Luther says so eloquently, we come before God as beggars with empty hands, asking for mercy and daily bread. It is the recognition that all that we have, all that we are, is a gift from God, and that without God we have nothing. It is a recognition that before God, none of what we think we have can begin to repair the damage done by humanity's lust for power, prestige, success, our curved in upon ourselvesness, all those things that Luther lifts up again and again. That before God, and in light of the cross, the death and resurrection of Christ, we have nothing to offer. We can only come with empty hands, praying that God would be merciful to us, poor and sinful, broken and battered. We come to recognize that perspective, to see in the face of God the merciful judge. And as such, it reminds us of our standing with one another. That if we come before God with nothing, then why should we feel so puffed up about our lives with one another? That was a hard lesson for me to learn from Peachy, because I'm very competitive. It's in my DNA. The idea of a participation trophy just turns my stomach. And yet what Peachy taught me was that when one has that perspective before God and recognizes that all that one has is a gift, then it's a gift that we can share. And even that competitiveness can be used for the sake of your neighbor and the brother or sister. And so I've learned that competitiveness can actually build up community, that my pushing myself to new and bigger things actually serves the rest of the community as well. What if we all began to think in those terms? As the writers of the Old Testament so eloquently put, our call is to walk humbly before God and with one another. How do we do that in a way that isn't self-aggrandizing, but rather builds up community? An interesting challenge that God puts before us, one worthy to consider. Amen.